That name alone tells us something powerful. The Chachapoya lived on the edge of the Andes and the Amazon. Their homes were built high on ridges, where mist rolled through valleys and steep cliffs cut the land. It was not easy for outsiders to reach them. That was their strength, and that strength would soon be tested when the largest empire in South America came to their door. But before the Inca arrived, the Chachapoya had already built a world of their own. Their land, now part of northern Peru, was rich and green. They carved terraces for farming. They grew maize, potatoes, and quinoa. They kept llamas for transport. They made textiles and weapons. They built round stone houses in clusters with walls that stood against the rain and wind. Their great fortress, Cuelap, still rises today as a sign of their skill. The Chachapoya were not one people in a single city. They were many groups spread across valleys and ridges. Each group had its own leaders. They came together in times of need. Outsiders said they were tall and strong. They carried bows and spears. They painted their faces and wore feathers. They buried their dead in cliffs where carved sarcophagi still stare across the valleys. Death, to them, was not the end, but part of the land. When the Inca began to expand, they looked for weakness. They wanted unity. They wanted a single ruler to negotiate with. But in Chachapoya land, there was no single ruler. That made conquest harder. That made resistance possible. The Inca rise was fast. From Cusco, they moved across the Andes, conquering one people after another. By the 15th century, their empire stretched across modern Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and beyond. They had armies, roads, and storehouses. They had generals trained in war. They could move tens of thousands of men with speed. Few could resist them for long, but the Chachapoya did. Early reports say the Inca first marched into Chachapoya territory during the rule of Tupac Inca Yupanqui, the son of Pachacuti. His armies were strong. They had already subdued many peoples, but the Chachapoya did not bow. They fought back from their ridges, using the land as their ally. For years, the fighting went on. Why did they resist so fiercely? Part of the reason was their land. The Andes gave them barriers, forests, and fog. Part of it was their pride. They were known for independence. To lose it would mean giving up everything. And part of it was fear. They knew what happened when the Inca conquered. People were moved, leaders were taken, customs were replaced. The Chachapoya wanted none of that. Still, the Inca did not give up. They sent wave after wave of armies. At times, the Chachapoya won. At times, they lost. But their resistance became known across the empire. When other groups heard of the Chachapoya, they heard of a people who refused to fall quietly. That spirit is what makes their story so powerful today. Yet this is only the beginning. Their greatest struggles were still ahead. The Inca would find new ways to break them, and the Chachapoya, in turn, would find new ways to fight back. The clash between these two worlds was far from over. The clash came under the rule of Tupac Inca Yupanqui. He was the son of Pachacuti, the great builder of Cusco. By his time, the Inca had stretched their empire far into the north. His armies had already subdued the Chimu on the coast and many groups in the highlands. The Chachapoya stood in the way of further expansion into the cloud forests. To leave them free was a risk. They could raid Inca supply lines. They could ally with other enemies. So conquest became a necessity for the empire. The early Inca expeditions into Chachapoya land were not easy. The valleys were narrow, the cliffs steep. Marching large armies was slow. The Chachapoya took advantage of this. They built defenses along ridges and used surprise attacks. They rained arrows and stones down on Inca troops climbing the slopes. In open battle, the Inca had better armor and larger numbers, but in ambush, the Chachapoya had the advantage. One of the first turning points came when Tupac Inca himself led a campaign into the region. His commanders were skilled, but he wanted the victory to be complete. The Inca were known for their patience. They did not simply destroy. They encircled. They cut off food and water. They wore enemies down. Against the Chachapoya, this strategy was tested. Cuelap, the great fortress, became a symbol of that test. Its walls stood at 60 feet high. The Inca had never faced such a fortress before. Sources say battles around Cuelap and other strongholds dragged on for years. The Chachapoya fought bravely, but the Inca were relentless. They built supply depots along the way. They forced captured groups to fight for them. They returned year after year. Slowly, they pushed deeper into the valleys. The Chachapoya were strong, but the Inca had resources that seemed endless. At last, some Chachapoya chiefs gave in. They offered submission to avoid destruction. Yet many others kept resisting. This was not unusual. In the Andes, alliances shifted quickly. A group might submit one year, then rebel the next. The Inca had to spend as much energy keeping conquered peoples under control as they did in conquering new ones. With the Chachapoya, that problem became extreme. The Inca solution was brutal but effective. They began moving entire Chachapoya communities out of their homeland. This practice, known as mitma, was common in the empire. Loyal groups were moved into rebellious lands. Rebellious groups were scattered across the empire. It broke unity and reduced the chance of revolt. Thousands of Chachapoya families were relocated to Cusco, to the coast, and to distant valleys. In return, loyal Inca settlers were brought into Chachapoya territory. This was a heavy blow. Families were torn apart. Leaders were stripped of their power. Traditions tied to the land were disrupted. Yet the Chachapoya spirit of resistance did not end. Many of those relocated became known as proud warriors. They were used in the Inca army to fight in distant wars, but they never lost their memory of their homeland. The fighting, however, was not just military, it was cultural. The Inca imposed their language, Quechua, as the official tongue. They demanded loyalty to the sun god, Inti. They required labor for state projects. For the Chachapoya, who had their own traditions and gods, this was another form of conquest. Accepting it meant losing identity. Resisting it meant facing punishment. Many chose resistance, quietly or openly. Reports from Spanish chroniclers later tell us that the Chachapoya never fully accepted Inca rule. Even when forced into service, they rebelled when given the chance. Some fled into the forests, beyond the reach of Cusco. Some waited for moments of weakness in the empire. In this way, their story is not just one of defeat, but of endurance. One detail that shows the intensity of the clash is how the Inca viewed the Chachapoya. Garcilaso de la Vega, the mestizo chronicler, recorded that the Inca admired their bravery but feared their rebellion. To the Inca, the Chachapoya were both a prize and a problem. Controlling their land opened paths to the Amazon, but leaving them free meant constant unrest. At the same time, the Chachapoya were not alone in resisting the Inca. Across the Andes, other groups rose against Cusco's expansion. The Coya, the Huanca, the Chimu, each had their turn, but few held out as long and fiercely as the Chachapoya. That is why their story is remembered. They were never simply swallowed into the empire. They fought until the very end of Inca rule. A curious pattern emerged. Each time the Inca thought they had pacified the Chachapoya, another rebellion broke out. Sometimes it was small, just a village refusing to pay tribute. Sometimes it was large, with valleys rising together. This cycle wore on the empire. It forced the Inca to station permanent garrisons in the region. No other frontier demanded so much attention for so long. One of the most important rebellions came late in the Inca period, when Huayna Capac, son of Tupac Inca, ruled. He had extended the empire even further north, into present-day Ecuador. But as he fought there, the Chachapoya rose again. The rebellion had to be crushed with force. Many were executed.
Others were resettled again. Yet the cycle repeated itself. The Chachapoya would not rest.
The clash with the Inca was not just about territory. It was about survival of a culture. The Chachapoya were not a single kingdom. They had no great capital, no single king. They were a network of valleys, villages, and chiefs. This made them both vulnerable and resilient. The Inca could defeat one valley, but another would rise. They could break one chief, but unity could reform elsewhere. Looking back, this clash set the stage for the future. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found a people still restless under Inca control. The Chachapoya saw the newcomers not as conquerors at first, but as possible allies against their old enemy. Their long fight with the Inca had taught them one lesson above all. Empires rise, but they also fall. To survive, one must adapt, resist, and wait for the right moment. The story of the clash, then, is not just about war. It is about the persistence of a people who refused to vanish. The Inca won battles, but the Chachapoya won memory. Their resistance lived on in stories, in stone, and in the choices they made when the next great power came into the Andes. For the Inca, conquest was not the end. It was only the beginning of control. The empire's strength did not rest only on armies. It rested on systems. Roads, labor taxes, governors, storehouses, and religion were tools of power. When they brought the Chachapoya into their empire, they tried to use all of these tools. Yet each step created new tensions. One of the most painful measures was the mitma. This policy forced groups to leave their homelands and settle elsewhere in the empire. The goal was to break unity. Families who resisted together in the cloud forests would struggle to resist if they were scattered across valleys hundreds of miles away. Loyal groups would be moved into their lands to keep watch. This happened to thousands of Chachapoya families. In Cusco, in the coast, in distant valleys, Chachapoya men and women were forced to start again. They farmed for the empire. They worked on roads and terraces. They wove textiles for Inca nobles. Some became soldiers, trained and armed to fight the enemies of Cusco. On the surface, they looked absorbed into the empire. But inside, they carried resentment. They had lost their lands. They had lost their freedom. In their homeland, the Chachapoya who remained faced constant surveillance. Inca governors and garrisons were stationed in the valleys. Tribute was demanded. Food, textiles, and labor. Every year, men were taken for mita service, forced to build roads or serve in the army. For many, this felt like slavery. Yet some used it to their advantage. Chachapoya soldiers became famous for their bravery. They fought in distant campaigns in Ecuador, in Chile, in Bolivia. Their skills as archers and warriors gained them respect. But respect did not erase their longing for freedom. Religion became another tool of control. The Inca worshipped Inti, the sun god. They spread his cult to every corner of the empire. Temples were built. Priests were sent. Chachapoya gods were pushed aside. Yet this control was never complete. High in the cliffs, in caves and sarcophagi, the Chachapoya kept honoring their ancestors. They mummified their dead. They placed them in sacred spots overlooking valleys. These practices could not be erased by decree. They were too deep in the people's hearts. The turning points in this story came not only from what the Inca did, but from what the Chachapoya refused to do. Each rebellion that broke out was a reminder that control was fragile. Under Tupac Inca Yupanqui, under Huayna Capac, the cycle repeated. Rebellion, repression, resettlement. Yet the rebellions kept coming. That persistence showed that conquest did not equal loyalty. One of the largest turning points came during Huayna Capac's reign. By then, the empire was stretched thin. He had pushed into Ecuador, where fierce groups like the Cañari resisted him. His armies were far from Cusco. The Chachapoya saw the moment and rose again. The rebellion was crushed with harsh punishment. Many were executed. Many more were scattered.
But the lesson was clear. The Chachapoya would not give the empire peace. Still, survival sometimes meant compromise. Some chiefs chose to ally with the Inca. They gained privileges in return. They were allowed to keep local authority if they pledged loyalty. Some families intermarried with Inca nobles. These strategies allowed certain groups to endure without total loss of status. But beneath the surface, identity remained strong. The roundhouses, the textiles, the cliff burials, all these remained symbols of being Chachapoya. Forced survival also had another cost. Disease began to spread. Long before Europeans arrived, disease moved through the Andes with armies and trade. Crowded conditions in new settlements made it worse. Mortality rose. Communities shrank. To many Chachapoya, this felt like part of conquest itself, nature turning against them after their lands had been broken. Yet, not all was loss. The Chachapoya left traces of resilience. Archaeological evidence shows continued building at Cuelap and other sites well into the Inca period. Some communities blended Inca and local styles, carving out space to survive within the empire. Others disappeared into the forests, away from roads and governors, where they lived beyond the reach of Cusco. These were small victories, but they mattered. The most important turning point was psychological. The Chachapoya came to understand the Inca not as permanent masters, but as temporary rulers. They had seen how empires could be challenged. They had fought, lost, and still held their identity. This belief would shape their choices when a new power arrived from across the sea. Spanish chroniclers, writing later, recorded that the Chachapoya greeted the Spaniards as allies against the Inca. This choice was not sudden. It came from decades of forced survival under Cusco. It came from the memory of lost families, broken lands, and endless tribute. The Spaniards were invaders, yes, but to the Chachapoya, they were also a chance to break free of the Inca once and for all.
Religion became another tool of control. The Inca worshipped Inti, the sun god. They spread his cult to every corner of the empire. Temples were built. Priests were sent. Chachapoya gods were pushed aside. Yet this control was never complete. High in the cliffs, in caves and sarcophagi, the Chachapoya kept honoring their ancestors. They mummified their dead. They placed them in sacred spots overlooking valleys. These practices could not be erased by decree. They were too deep in the people's hearts. The turning points in this story came not only from what the Inca did, but from what the Chachapoya refused to do. Each rebellion that broke out was a reminder that control was fragile. Under Tupac Inca Yupanqui, under Huayna Capac, the cycle repeated: rebellion, repression, resettlement. Yet the rebellions kept coming. That persistence showed that conquest did not equal loyalty.